Okay, guys, this video um, is about comparing the debate that I see online today is between teaching in South Korea as opposed to China. And I was in South Korea for 12 years, and then I went to the Middle East, into Saudi Arabia for almost 3 years, and then I went to China for the last 8 years. And you have to know a little bit about the history of Korea for teaching English. So prior to 1995, an awful lot of people that I went to university with, they ended up going to Japan for a couple of years working. Some of the guys got married to Japanese ladies and stayed there. Japan is the most civilized society on earth, and it's very easy to see how people are comfortable there. It's extremely safe, very clean, very organized. Um, in 1995, the Japanese market was relatively saturated. It was very easy to get a job teaching in Japan. It may not be a fun job, and you would be lucky to break even. You know, if you were experienced and you had private lessons and you had contacts in the corporate world, you could make money. You can still go to Japan today. Most people I know who go to Japan today, it takes a few years to be, to build up your contacts and have a really good job. In 1995, they called it the Korean Wave, where people all left Japan and they moved to Korea. And at that time, there were not many foreigners in Korea, and Korea had very good pay, and it was very cheap to live there. And secondly, for private lessons and so on, people, anybody who wanted extra work could easily get extra work. There was no problem at all. Like, unless most people I knew were constantly, rejecting requests for private lessons or business classes or whatever. So, in South Korea, since 1995, a lot of people from around the world. It was the number one market in the world for TOEFL and TOEIC, and there was endless work. One of the reasons why is all the major companies. So, for example, Samsung. I worked at Samsung. Samsung really didn't care about the Korean market because it's such a small population. It's only 45 million. Samsung makes most of their money in the US and the EU, and in order to access those markets, you have to have English speakers. Also, English is a part of their high school exam, which is insane, and therefore, the mothers all wanted their kids to study English and in many cases have private lessons. So I worked at Seoul National University, and I never suggest anybody do that. But at Seoul National, 60% of the kids that worked there, lived there, studied there, came from well-to-do families. A lot of them were planning to go to the U.S., so everybody needs these English lessons, and they're willing to pay for it. Um, what happened was the economy of South Korea grew and grew and grew until about, say, 12, 15 years ago. And then what happened was the price of real estate started to increase very rapidly. And for a lot of teachers, so people who used to live in Seoul and work at a university in Seoul started moving outside the city and commuting in to work for about an hour. Some lived in Uijeongbu, Incheon, maybe up in the northeast corner of Seoul, where the rent was much cheaper, and taking a subway 45 minutes to work every day. And then what you had was, when I first got there, people would get a university job outside the city, maybe in Gwangju, and then they would move into Seoul with that experience. Now it's the opposite, they're moving to the cheaper places. Today, if you have a regular visa, you're not married to a Korean, you're gonna you're gonna be lucky to break even. The private lessons and the extra lessons go to the ones who are married or have the F2 visa. Now, in China, in recent years, the Chinese economy has grown, so they spend a lot of money on English lessons. And when I first moved to China, it was so cheap there. It was, I couldn't believe how cheap it was. And, some of my coworkers would only spend $25 a week because they would eat 3 times at the school cafeteria, the university cafeteria, and then they might spend, some money after work having a coffee or something, but it was incredibly cheap. The second thing is the demand for English lessons in China has grown exponentially. However, There's a big thing that happened this year, and they closed all the training centers. Now, if you're into kindergartens, there's still a huge demand. But there's about 1,000 international schools in China today, and they pay very, very well. And you can save a decent amount of money, and it's not so bad. So some of the important things about China is you don't have to teach English. You can teach math. You can teach geography. You can teach music. You can teach art, which is much more interesting. China is much bigger than Korea, so you get to explore all these different lands, which is really fantastic as well. And people often ask me, because I worked in Korea, I worked in Saudi Arabia, and I worked in China, and everyone says, "Oh, you can make the most money in Saudi Arabia." You can make the most money in Saudi Arabia on an hourly basis, but I don't recommend anybody do that. When I worked in Saudi Arabia at a university, we worked 24 weeks of the year, and the days that we did work, we'd have 3 classes a day for about an hour, and then you'd have an hour of office hours, and then you go home. Well, Saudi Arabia, to me, specifically for women, you should never go there to work. I would never recommend anybody go there, any women go there to work. And there are certain types of personalities who can do well in Saudi Arabia. If you like to stay inside and be alone, watch movies, play games all day, you can do all right in Saudi Arabia. You have an incredible amount of free time, and you have to work really hard to stay busy at that time. It sounds kind of odd, but you got to keep yourself busy, unless you can sleep excessively, or you can spend time alone. I used to go to the gym, but it was too boring, and you had to be so careful about what you said and did in Saudi Arabia. In China, you can make more money overall. It's a much freer society, relatively speaking. Freedom in terms of going outside, walking anywhere you want. When you go to Starbucks, you don't have to go to the single men section. And it's China is a much nicer environment. In Saudi Arabia, sometimes the temperatures were up to 40, 45, 50 degrees. Your eyes, you feel the water going up. China is a much more enjoyable place to work, like a place like Shenzhen or Guangzhou, and the work environment is much nicer because you can teach a subject you want. However, I would say this, that China is by no means perfect, and you are very restricted in what you say, specifically the criticism of any government. Today, if I was going to go back to work in one of those countries, it would easily be China, and it would easily be the southern province or Shanghai. I'm not really sure which one. Anyway, I hope that feel free to ask me any questions about it, and happy teaching.